This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. And for our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I am your host, Andrew Camp, and in this podcast, we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. And today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Paul Schutz. Born and raised in Evansville, Indiana, Paul received his BA in English from Boston College and his MA and PhD in systematic theology from Fordham University. After teaching on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, he served for several years as director of worship at St. Mary Catholic Church in Evansville. His time working as a musician and liturgist was his gateway into the study of theology. His research focuses on the meaning and significance of creation in the Christian tradition, with an emphasis on how scientific research might inform religious accounts of humanity's relationship with other creatures. His recent publications apply the theological writings of the Jesuit astrophysicist William Steger to questions of gender, race, and interreligious dialogue, as well as prayer, liturgy, and ministry. His book, A Theology of Flourishing, which we'll be discussing in this podcast, explores the potential of flourishing to serve as a starting point and center of gravity for Christian theology and spirituality, and a basis for cultivating a robust praxis of ecological and social justice. In his free time, Paul enjoys reading, music, travel, hiking, cooking, baking, and eating. He lives in San Jose, California with his partner and dog, Albert. So thanks for joining me today, Paul. It's great to have this time to talk about your book.
Thank you, Andrew. It's great to be with you.
Yeah. And, what all you enjoy is everything I enjoy in life too. Nothing wrong with reading, music, travel, hiking, cooking, baking. Like, that's life.
No, it's a good list, right?
Yeah.
Especially the food part, given the podcast itself. Yeah.
No, flourishing is all about travel, hiking, cooking, baking, and eating, in my opinion. But
100%.
Who am I to say?
Well, I mean, I'd agree with the list.
Yes, sure.
For sure.
Yes. Yeah. So I want to start here. It's what, as you think back about your life, like, where has food and the table informed how you now view the world today?
In huge ways. I grew up in a pretty big family that is half German and half Lebanese.
Oh, wow.
And on both sides, food and family were sort of the center. Coming together around the table were the center of our family life. I remember from a very young age, my Lebanese grandmother in particular cooking kibbeh and other things like that. It was sort of an event, for the family. We'd all either go to their house or folks would come over to ours, and we would gather around, a wonderful table of Lebanese foods around the holidays, Christmas in particular, Thanksgiving, we'd gather. And on my dad's side, it was the same thing, which for the sort of, normative, white European culture in the United States maybe isn't as common, but my dad grew up in a very small German Catholic enclave community in southern Indiana. And every Sunday we would go up to Jasper, up to his hometown, and my grandmother, along with a couple of my dad's sisters, brothers, folks, would cook this elaborate meal. She was a baker. She home baker, baked wedding cakes for people in the town out of her home, and basically was fed the town and made the wedding cakes for all of her kids when they got married, all that kind of stuff. So every Sunday we were gathered around this big long table, and then as the family grew, there was a kids table, and we had these wonderful dishes, fried chicken and mashed potatoes that are just beyond compare in my memory. Your grandmother's cooking is always the best cooking, I think, for a lot of people. And so food and table and family were at the core of, I think, my young personal development. And it was always preceded by prayer. It was always in a spirit of prayer and sharing fellowship and community, playing cards on my dad's side, playing games, watching, shows, doing silly theatrical things on my mom's side, but whatever it was, that the table and the meal were at the center of all of it.
Wow. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with a full table of German food or Midwest food and then Lebanese food. Like that sounds,
Yeah,
you know, I'm hungry just thinking about it right now.
me too.
I know. That's the
Maybe we should quit and have lunch. I don't know,
problem.
but no,
Yeah.
it's yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's the problem with doing a podcast sometimes about food and the table is you start talking about food and, all of a sudden you're like, wait, nope, focus on the conversation
No,
because I want to,
focus,
yeah,
right.
yeah,
Talk first, eat later. Yeah.
yeah. So then how, like, when and how did then flourishing sort of begin to take shape, of this center for you?
Mm. I'd say that there are kind of two or three parts to that story. The first one is personal, and I think it starts with my family. It starts with the love that I experienced as a kid. It starts with the way that, my family and friends kind of mediated what I would say is God's love to me and taught me that. I grew up in a family that I've already kind of talked a
Yeah.
little bit about. Um, but on top of that, there was always this sense of our Catholicism, our faith being sort of imbued with the love of God. I didn't grow up with a particularly doctrinaire Catholicism. I grew up with a very active, very engaged,
Mm.
going to church, being involved in church, doing all the things. Sometimes I say devout, but not particularly pious is one way you
Okay.
could talk about it. Family, very for the salt of the earth, but committed to justice and care for others and service and those kinds of things. Those are the primary manifestations of kind of our faith. And
Mm.
so I think that somehow in that, even though, this is in a time in my life when I wasn't conscious of it and certainly wasn't thinking about it like a scholar thinks about it, that was about flourishing. That was the
Yeah.
seedbed for me receiving a Christianity that was deeply engaged, but was ultimately about the love of God bringing about the fullness of life
Mm.
for me as a person, for those in my family, for the whole world. I mean, we were also really caring for creation from a very young age. And so all of that is there, kind
Yeah.
of the little seeds were planted. And I'd say that those seeds kind of sprouted and took root in a very special way in the years that I was working professionally in ministry as a
Yeah.
as a musician, liturgist. That's my kind of background. And so I landed after teaching for 2 years on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. I landed in this parish in downtown Evansville, Indiana, my hometown, and did not know that this parish really existed. Certainly didn't know what they were up to as a kid. If I had, I would have been there. I
Mm.
mean, they were this wonderfully justice oriented, Eucharistically centered community that was thriving at the
Wow.
time. I walked into something I never thought, I thought I was coming in for a year to take a gap year, so to speak, between undergrad and grad school. Turned out that I was there for almost 5 years because I just fell in love with the place and the work.
Mm.
And it was that experience of witnessing a community gathered at the Eucharistic table. And here I'm thinking of, connections between the tables I was at as a kid and the Eucharistic
Right.
table. It was that family of faith gathered Sunday after Sunday around that table that was really radically transformative for me
Mm.
and is the reason why I ended up doing a PhD in theology. It wasn't ever in the cards for me
Yeah.
until I had that lived experience of this community flourishing individually and collectively in relationship with God around the table, and then seeing that work break out and go out to try to serve the world, foster the flourishing of others. And so that was huge. And then, the third part is the academic part,
Yeah.
and that we'll say more about probably as we go. But my intellectual formation at Fordham was also really, really wonderfully communal and
Mm.
centered on even food, having meals together, gathering together, these kinds of things. But out of that came this deep sense that theology as an academic discipline is not just sort of armchair analysis, as we
No.
say. We don't just sit around and think the big thoughts, but this is about, taking the best of what Christianity can be, seeking, I should say,
Yeah.
the best of what Christianity can be, and bringing that to the church, bringing that to our lives of faith. And I think that all of that together, especially my engagement with, I would say, feminist and, queer and liberationist perspectives on theology, is what led me to come to this idea that Christians believe in a God who desires the fullness of life for all creation, and to say a lot of people have been talking about that, but let's go deep on it and see
Yeah.
what we can find. And so those three things together, I think, in my sort of trajectory, are what inspired the idea of taking flourishing as this starting point and center of gravity.
I love it. And I love how you said it, that like, this isn't just an armchair exercise for you, but this is really born out of family, church life, academic life, and really your goal isn't just to give us more nice cognitive thoughts,
No.
but really to propel, the church and believers, whoever wants to follow Jesus or want to pursue justice, to, okay, what's a framework in which we can think about this?
Exactly. That is the inspiration. I can't do theology anymore without an awareness of pastoral and social and ecclesiological and ecological realities. And I think that any theology that doesn't approach its work in that way is in some way deprived of a big part of what it should be about.
The people I love the most are, I love great thinkers, and you write this great book that propelled me to think deeply, but that it's not, again, it's nestled in the life of church and community and not outside of it. And I think that's the best theology, because it's nice to propose ideas, but if you're not working them out in the context of life, like, we need help figuring this out.
Absolutely.
What I really appreciated about your book is that, growing up, and living sort of in this white evangelical conservative world, and hearing all of the deconstruction and, the changes that need to happen given in light of, our current president, and the current state of the church, and so I hear a lot of what's wrong, but I rarely hear how to move forward. And so I think your book begins to say, okay, like, we know there needs to be new theology done in light of the world's challenges, and that how do we do it? And how do we actually construct a more beautiful way? And, that's where your book comes in.
I really appreciate that. Yeah. And that's the goal. I mean, is to, name what's wrong. I go to, the liberation theology tradition for this dynamic of denunciation and enunciation. We have to name what's wrong. We have to deconstruct. Right. We have to critique, but we also have to announce the gospel. We also have to, propose a new way, and do that not only in thought, but also in practice, in life, because we need that way forward. We need a new platform to stand on, new language, whatever it might be. And, if this book contributes in some small way to the cultivation of that, then I'll be happy, with the work.
Right. Yeah. And, in the centering text, I guess, if I could say it, for your book, is really John 10:10. It's a phrase that many Christians know, and it's Jesus's words that, the thief only seeks to destroy and kill. But then Jesus's words is, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly.
That's right. Yeah.
So unpack us, because I think we have some ideas of what that verse means. And some of them may not be accurate or, in line with what you're thinking. And so, like, unpack it. Help us begin to unpack.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that, that verse has always resonated with me out of my experience. And I've always thought there's something there. There's something really critical there. So there's a couple of dimensions to why I think that verse came to occupy the center of my thinking. And they get at other parts of the project that we'll probably talk about as we go forward. So the first one is, what do we mean by abundant life? Well, historically in Christian circles across denominations, I think that abundant life, or that fullness of life, eternal life, right? All of those different things, different variations on a theme of life, have pointed toward an idea of heavenly salvation and union with God, right? And that's good. And that is the destination. That is the goal, that is the vision for our Christian life. But so often a hyper focus on heavenly salvation can lead our attention away from the realities of the world. And Jesus had a lot to say about the realities of the world too. Right? So there's this kind of, bifurcation that happens between heavenly reality and earthly reality, between spirit and body, spirit and matter, those kinds of things. And if we follow that and really, take that up, I think what we come to see is that there is the possibility that a hyper focus on heavenly salvation can lead us to ignore or even degrade the earth or our bodies as sinful, broken, fallen, which often they are, but that's not the whole story. This abundant life has something to do with this world. It has something to do with life in our bodies and life in our communities here and now, because Jesus had a lot to say about that too.
Right.
And so what I want to do with that verse, is reorient the relationship between our understanding of salvation and our understanding of this world. So when we talk about sin, when we talk about all these things, we have to take that idea of abundant life, meaning the fullness of life, the flourishing of every creature, human and otherwise, in this world, as a starting point for understanding what heavenly salvation is. Because surely if we do that, we're going to achieve, union with God in heaven too. So that's one part. But to kind of broaden that out and bring it back to the scripture verse a little bit more explicitly, I think there's something really important going on there. The second part of the verse, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly, has always received the lion's share of attention.
Right. Yep.
In Christian discourse. It's nice. It sounds good. We like to talk about abundant life. We like to think about heaven, these kinds of things. But the first part of the verse, and this comes in a parable, the chapter on the shepherd and the sheep in John, and Jesus is sort of relating himself, scripture scholars point out, with the gate. I am the gate, the way in. And we think of Jesus' way, truth, and life. So it's another, way that we can kind of put those ideas together. Jesus is the way in. Well, the thief, in contrast to Jesus himself, comes to kill and to steal and to destroy. So whatever that abundant life idea in the second half of the verse means, its meaning emerges when we reflect critically and carefully on what kills and steals and destroys. Right? So those are the opposite those are opposites that Jesus is setting up in the verse. So we have to ask that critical question: what in our world, and you mentioned the current administration, you mentioned, ecological and social realities, what in our world is killing, stealing, and destroying abundant life? And I think about that in the book, not just individually on this paradigm of sort of like, my sinfulness is killing my possibility of heavenly salvation. That's a very narrow understanding. Right? There are social and structural and ecological forces that every day are killing, degrading, stealing the lives of others. Thinking of a world in which, we have bottled water in abundance and, a huge percentage of the world lacks access to clean, drinkable water on a daily basis. How is that okay? Is that not a form of the theft of, what makes possible abundant life?
Yeah.
I ask those kinds of questions and I want to interrogate that. So yes, that verse is doing a lot of work, and those are kind of a couple of big ways that it orients the whole project.
I love that because, like you said, it is a verse that people resonate and we feel this drawn towards, right? Because I think internally, wherever you stand, whatever tradition within Christianity you've faced, you face that tension of like, okay, Jesus promises abundant life, but it doesn't feel right now. When I was in seminary, I remember joking about this verse because, my seminary was about spiritual formation and a lot of it influenced by St. John of the Cross and Dark Night of the Soul. And so a lot of deep introspection work and dealing with, our habits and, sinful habits and family of origin and what prevents us from, Jesus. And I remember one point I'm like, if this is what abundant life is, like, this isn't what I signed up for, right? Like,
right.
But then like, I think you help us reframe it. Cause I think, when I was thinking about that verse, it's all about me and what is, how do I get abundant life? Whereas you're looking at the whole world, not just humanity, not just individuals, but like creative, all of creation, living and non-living.
Absolutely. And as folks read the book, one of the things you'll see, and I say this not as an advertisement, just as something that I was aware of as I was writing, is, as you write, there are these phrases that you keep repeating.
Yeah.
And one of the little phrases that I kept putting was this, like, comma separated, individually and collectively, over and over and over again, individually and collectively, and because it's both, it is both. Absolutely. Our individual salvation, our individual flourishing matters. And so does the flourishing of the whole, socially, ecologically, every species, living and non-living, as you said. So because, right, we as individuals are not separate from, nor are we separable from those systems that we live in. We are part of them. We live within them. And
Yeah.
so to think of our own flourishing is necessarily to think of the flourishing of everything else around us. And I think Christianity calls us not to get away from the world, but to enter more deeply into it in love on
Hmm.
behalf of that flourishing that you're talking about for everything.
Yeah.
And that really is the vision.
Right. But that also requires, that deeper engagement requires work. It requires, dealing with my own selfishness, but then also being willing to listen to other voices that I may not
Absolutely.
be more prone to listen to, because you say that, this flourishing, we need to give primacy of place to those that have been oppressed or marginalized.
Yeah. Because whatever flourishing means, my contention would be that, we're going to understand it the most fully when we listen to the voices of the oppressed and marginalized and the voiceless,
Yeah.
people who cannot speak, but also other creatures who cannot speak, reflecting on that, reflecting on the reality of suffering. A lot of people would say, oh, a theology of flourishing, that sounds great. But one of the critical questions that always comes up is, how do we deal with suffering? And my answer to that in the book is through radical closeness to suffering, radical attunement to suffering, radical listening, deep
Yeah.
listening, as you said, to those who are suffering under whatever conditions they're suffering. Because out of that will come this deeper and fuller awareness of what it means to experience the fullness of life. And we don't come to those encounters as individual humans, say with creation or with another human. We don't come to them with answers. We don't come to them with, Bible verses ready to quote, either as a sort of panacea or some sort of, nice little, stopgap, oh, everything will get better, or as an instrument of condemnation. We don't come to those situations like that. We come to them with open hearts and open ears.
Hmm.
Maybe we could even say we come to them as we would come to someone at a table, right?
Yeah.
To share a meal, right? With that kind of openness. And then I'm inspired by my colleague Jessica Koblentz's work, who writes on mental health, depression,
Mm.
theology. And she has this great phrase where she says, a Christianity that is attuned to mental health, mental illness, is a Christianity that can stay with suffering
Wow.
and not avoid it, not
Yeah.
evade it, not pull away from it, but stay with it, enter. And she doesn't mean that the sufferer stays with the suffering. It means that the person accompanying the sufferer stays with the suffering, right?
Mm.
Stays with it in closeness. Sometimes that accompaniment is all that we need, because with that, and in my book, this is the way I talk about it, comes this deep attunement to reality, this deep awareness of what reality is and how it works. And that attunement is what allows us to know what God is calling us to, what we are called to be discerning in the middle of the reality we inhabit, so that we can flourish and bring others into that, what I call glorious liveliness,
Yeah.
of God's presence breaking out of us into the world and transforming all of it by grace.
A lot there you said worth unpacking. First, and you used the word multiple times in your book, but the sort of the call to radical hospitality.
Yeah.
And that's what you were describing, of just this attunement, inviting people, walking alongside.
Yes.
Henry Nouwen's definition of hospitality is the one I always come back to, because I feel like it's that posture of creating that free space where others can be who they are truly meant to be.
Yeah.
Uh,
And for me, who they are truly meant to be is who God has
yeah,
created them to be,
right.
right? And that's my understanding of what it means to flourish, is to enter more fully into that, to being that person or being that creature,
Yeah,
having that space. Yeah.
right. Because then the other word that plays heavily into your work is from John Duns Scotus, and I can't speak Latin, but the
Hectaetas. Yeah. Hectaetas.
Haietas, yes.
Yeah.
Because I think it's important, because again, coming from a Western mindset, we want to speak flourishing into people, or we feel like we have, I think especially coming from a evangelical mindset, sometimes we have the answers. You just need to listen to us.
Yeah.
And it plays into a lot of places, not just evangelicalism. But like
No.
you're talking about this idea that this, this particular thisness of every created thing, if I'm quoting and making sense of John Duns Scotus correctly,
That's right.
like
Yeah.
help, because I think this is super important when we think about flourishing. So
Yeah.
help us understand this
Unpack that a little bit.
because
Sure. Yeah, so that Latin word haec or haec means this. It means just this.
Okay.
And so the cheitas is like the condition of being something. So it's the
Okay.
condition of being this, right? That's where that's the etymology, right, in Latin. So we're talking about what it means to be this. And for Duns Scotus, and I have to say from the beginning, I'm doing a little bit more than he was with the concept,
Okay.
following some other scholars, especially in the Franciscan tradition. But I think it's valid. In his day, he was trying to answer a philosophical debate about the relationship between universals and particulars. Do we start from the universal and go to the particular? Do we start from the particular and go to the universal? Okay, we don't have to talk about that. But that's the question he was trying to answer.
He was a medieval theologian in which they were
a medieval theologian.
Crazy things that have very little application to modern day life, it feels like.
We would think, and these may still be debated, but anyhow, he starts with this. He starts with the particular.
Okay.
And when I think about that in light of the gospel, and here's where the theological move happens, I think maybe there's something there about understanding how God sees the world, or the way that God values creatures. God values every blade of grass as this. That's very scriptural, right? God can count the hairs, individual hairs on our heads. So God loves each individual person or each individual squirrel or whatever it might be, not as a squirrel in terms of the category, right, the general, but as this squirrel, as this person, as Andrew, as Paul, as whoever, right? So God loves the world in its particularity. And that's the sort of theological extension of this discussion of Hecheitas. So for flourishing, if we're talking about flourishing as the becoming the fullness of what one is, right? And again, not just humans, but every creature in its own way, what that means is that Andrew is called to become the fullness of Andrew, this, right? Paul, this squirrel, that blade of grass, this river, right? Whatever, this molecule even, who knows, how deep the love of God goes, how God, knows and loves the world. But the idea is that if that's the framing, then whatever it means to flourish emerges from a creature's own thisness, from their own hikcheitas. It can't, like you said, just be imposed from the top down. And I think, the Catholic analog to sometimes the preconceived or pre-packaged scriptural answers that we see in some other Christian denominations often lives in the catechism. I recently have said that I think one of the big things that Catholicism is struggling with right now is the idea that the catechism is an answer book for everything. And so you can just go to this page, but then what about scripture? The Catholic tradition has never said, has always said that scripture is the final answer, the final norm for everything, and tradition. So I think that in all of our traditions, there's the possibility of a fundamentalism of sorts that says, if you would just listen to me, if you would just listen to what the church teaches or what the Bible says, you would have the answer. But I'm challenging that with this idea that when we start from the presupposition of the love of God, which is what Duns Scotus and the other Franciscan thinkers of the time do, and bring that through Christ into this idea that God loves every creature, whatever it is, as this, then the meaning of flourishing is going to come through that creature's thisness. So a couple concrete examples of that. One is like, if you have a beloved, I have a dog named Albert. I wish I could bring him in and show him right now. But anyway, he's wonderful. I learned through my relationship with Albert what it means for Albert to be the fullness of what he is. I'm not here to make him, to command him, right? The classic sort of master-dog relationship. I'm in relationship with Albert. I love him. He's sweet. He's the best dog I've ever had in my entire life. Sorry, blessed memory of my previous, dog pets. But he is amazing. And I know his amazingness. I know what he wants, when he wants belly rubs, when he wants to play, when he wants to go outside, from my attunement to him, from me learning not what a dog is like, but what Albert is like,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
deepening that relationship. Well, the same goes for us in relationship to others. We discover the fullness of who we are as individual persons, as this is, so to speak,
Yeah.
in relationship to God, in our prayer, for sure, and also in relationship to others. And so if we go to a concrete example of this, like maybe a woman who feels the call to ordained ministry in a tradition that doesn't allow for it, or a trans person who experiences gender dysphoria, this misalignment, right, so to speak, of consciousness and body, right? And says, I am not the gender that I was assigned at birth. I need to do this. Those are matters in my framing. When flourishing is the starting point, those are matters of profound discernment, yeah, and often matters of profound suffering. As a cisgender man, I don't know what it's like for a trans person to experience gender dysphoria.
No.
That should not sort of precipitate this like me coming with answers. That should precipitate deep listening to the reality of trans people in their thisness, because I know the one thing I do know is that God desires this other person or this other creature to flourish in the fullness of what it is, in God's love, through God's grace. And it's my duty as a Christian to open myself to the other, to open myself to God's work in the other, and then accompany and foster and cultivate, right? Yeah. Whatever brings about that fullness. So that, is all, this Hectaetas idea, yeah, is the root of the starting point of an entire trajectory in my argument that kind of takes us toward deeper reflection on realities like the ones I've named, yeah, with that flourishing framework in mind.
So then, and this is where I struggled and wrestled a little bit, and I think you paved the way forward, but like, how does this particular thisness not lead to radical individuality, but rather how can it contribute to community flourishing? Because like, if everything is a particular, is there any place then for, systemic communal changes?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in fact, I think radical attention to the thisness of creatures leads to the radical transformation of the system because of that radical hospitality that you name, that radical compassion, or right, I call it revolutionary love in the chapter on the New Testament. Those kinds of practices pave the way for systemic transformation because they reorient us toward that deep listening and that space making that you talked about, that right, sharing that you talked about. If we really listened to the experience of oppressed populations, of marginalized populations, think of anti-Black racism in the history of the United States, for example. If we had really listened, or still really listen to the voices of Black and brown folks crying out under myriad forms of oppression that white people normally never experience, right, we probably wouldn't be so comfortable with the status quo. So there is this coming out of not only the individual, but the collective experience of people in their Hectaetas, right? Knowing that God doesn't, just care about that. God cares also about everyone. I think that discernment then, which is what I was talking about, and there, yeah, I'm deeply informed by the tradition of Ignatian spirituality, which really centers discernment. And that I have a whole chapter on that, yes, in the book, this becoming the fullness, discerning the way toward the fullness of what God is. Discernment always happens collectively. It's never just individual. So the image, and I think it's interesting that you went to maybe St. John of the Cross, or, you think of the great mystics of the tradition, think of the sculpture Teresa in Ecstasy, for example, right? It's this very sort of like, looking up to God. It's just me and my body having right, this radical transcendental experience. But whatever the meaning of that mystical experience was, came through in the communication of the experience to others. Right? It wasn't just like, I can't just say to you, I had this radical mystical experience and expect everybody to listen. The truth of it comes through when it enters into community and is broken and shared among the community, and others say, there is something of God in that experience. There is something of the grace of God working there. There's a recognition that has to happen.
Right.
that's all collective. That's all communal.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens in discernment. When we share our experiences of whatever it is that we're going through, when we go on a hike on a mountain peak and see, birds soaring over overhead, or a river running beside us, and we are overcome with a sense of awe and wonder, beauty, the beauty of creation. All of those are relational experiences. Those are ways in which we are always situated in community.
Yeah.
And so it can't break down, like this idea can't break down flourishing into a radical individualism, because whatever it means to flourish is only discerned in social and, I would add, ecological community, our relationships to the world.
Yeah.
And this is the same reason why, some might charge the framework with, leaning toward relativism too, a sort of anything goes. Well, you just said that this person is like that, and whatever I say I am is what I am. No. Right? I would caution against that, and I do in the book, because the truth of what someone is or something is discerned. And that's a two-way relationship.
Right.
So in prayer and in relationship is where we discover our thisness and what it is that God is calling us to be. And that's going to involve deep struggle and deep, work. But it's never just an assertion of oneself. It's not the sort of enlightenment individual, saying, this is what I am. No, it's discovering what we are through prayerful relationship with God and others. And so that's how I would respond to, charges, whether they be of a radical individualism or relativism. It's the community makes all the difference.
Because I think many times, if we're honest with ourselves, this idea of pursuing flourishing at the expense of others, like I'm just going to pursue what I need best, what's best for me, or what's best even for my family. Maybe we, in our family system, we're going to pursue what's best for our family, but it can never come at the expense, of humanity or creation, like you've said, ecological issues, that everything's intertwined.
Flourishing that comes at the expense of anything else is not flourishing.
No.
It's a form of self-aggrandizement rather than what I would call self-actualization or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. And sorry, if I can just say, the root of that is this discernment around God's intentions, right? That God actually intends the flourishing of the whole creation, with every creature in the fullness of what it is, individually and collectively. If that's the norm, then there's no room. You can't flourish while another suffers. And so that in itself leads to radical transformation on a social collective level, on a structural level, because if there are institutions or systems, anything from, clericalism to redlining to, racism baked into the fabric of a society, and that is obstructing the fullness of life for a person or community, then it has to be dealt with, because God intends those persons and communities to flourish.
Yeah. No, and I love that too, because it's the starting point isn't the fall anymore. The starting point is original creation. Like, who is God, and who does God want creation, all of his creation, to be, versus, hey, we live in a flawed system. It's going to be a flawed system. There's nothing we can do. Let's just grin and bear it. And
hope for something better, right? Yeah. Which gets us back to that escape hatch paradigm, where we're just trying to get out of the world. And I would just say, I spend a lot of time in the book arguing that point you just made about that original creation, or God's original intentions for creation. And they're there in Scripture when we look very carefully and do this analysis. And the one that always jumps out to me is on gender in Genesis 3, just to use that one. We have these 3 punishments that God enacts, right? Well, one of the punishments involves that infamous line, right? And he will rule over you, right? That the man shall rule over the woman in the social order. So it's an establishment, it's a justification of patriarchy, right? And even the subservience of women to men. But that is a punishment, right? Yeah. And we haven't dwelled on that part of the story, right?
No. Yeah.
If it's a punishment, it means that it wasn't that way in the original creation. It was not God's original intention. It's a change in the order of things, right? And if it's a change in the order of things, then that begs this, raises this deep critical question: what are Christians called to live for? Well, if we believe that Christ has brought redemption to the world, then shouldn't we be living on behalf of God's original intentions rather than accepting the broken order that results from sinfulness and then hoping for something better. Shouldn't we be working for something better? Because that's what God desires. And as Christians, we are called to align our will, our mind, our understanding, our hearts with what God intends.
Yeah.
So I think that shift, right, it's a shift to brokenness from an original perfection is so critical. But I ask, why hasn't the tradition talked about that? Why hasn't that been our focal point? Well, it legitimates things like patriarchy, I think that at times we've wanted that, and so there's a lot there when we go back to scripture and we really do this deep work. So in the first couple of chapters, on the Hebrew Bible and New Testament, I try to do some of that deeper work and get back to some of that to reconstruct a vision of who God is in relationship to the world as a foundation for this.
Right. So we're to engage this work like Jesus engaged this work. And as Jesus engaged this work, he got killed. It literally cost him his life. And so it's
not always easy.
No, but I think, that's, again, there's so many misconceptions around what flourishing in this life is going to be like it's just up and to the right. But we're going to hit, as we engage with the powers and the principalities or, whatever is going on that, seeks to destroy, we're going to hit forces and people that want to literally kill us. And so how does the cross give shape to a theology of flourishing?
Absolutely. That's a wonderful way to ask the question. The cross as the death and resurrection of Jesus. I want to put them together, and I think of Wolfhard Pannenberg, right, the great Lutheran theologian, who says, that in the Protestant context, I think it's true in the Catholic context too, that it's often been missed that the cross is meaningless without the resurrection, and the resurrection is meaningless without the cross, right? We can focus on one or the other. So that I would just name that as a way into thinking about this. Flourishing is the work of resurrection, I would say. That's another way we could think about it. Now I'm like, maybe I have a Christology here that is not in the book, for put it on my list.
Yeah.
Flourishing, fostering flourishing is the work of resurrection. It is the work of bringing about the fullness of life, which is what resurrection, achieves for all creation and working on behalf of that in this world. But you're absolutely right that does not come about Christologically in the story of Jesus without the crucifixion. Jesus, is killed for the way he lived. That is the fundamental fact of his ministry, is that he dies because of the way he lived. We are not called to death in that sense. We are not all called to some sort of self-sacrifice. It may happen to some. I mean, you think of the great witness of Martin Luther King, you think of great witnesses to this, martyrs who have lost their lives for causes of justice, who have lost their lives for the cause of the gospel. That resistance will be there. There will be, forces that will want to preserve the status quo because it empowers certain people and doesn't others. And there are people out there, maybe even listeners here, who will hear talk of, racism and women's ordination and trans folks and say whoa, you're getting into territory that's we can't go there, And I would say we have to go there because the love of God goes there. And that might involve struggling against institutions. That might involve, having uncomfortable conversations with pastors or friends or whatever it might be, especially in the current political climate. I mean, these things come up, but no one should be starving to death under the veil of war. War, as I've said, and as I say in the book, I have a section on peace, and war is a choice. War is not necessary in a sort of Christian eschatological vision. War is a choice that we make.
Right.
It's not human nature. It's not political. We've created all those systems. They can be different systems.
Yeah.
And I think that's the part that we often miss when we think about crucifixion and resurrection, is that Jesus operated with a vision of the world that was basically sort of, rooted in this commitment that the world doesn't have to be this way. My faith doesn't have to be this way. And yes, he died for that. And there will be struggle but the love of God brings hope and life out of struggle. And we as Christians are, I think, called to be committed to that love in its fullness and know that in the struggle, we are not alone. We are with others. We can find community. We can find, tables for dreaming and scheming this sort of new world that we could all live in. And that is part of the Christian life. So there is solace in the community. There's solace in the love of God guiding us. And that's the same love that brought life out of death in the case of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So the struggle is real, as they say, but I think the struggle is part of the call. And that image of taking up one's cross, is so vital in that.
It's also doing that hard work personally and because we all have our deep ingrained prejudices, and to not we need to name them as we engage in this work, because we will be confronted with our own heart, and our brokenness within us. And those are hard places to be sometimes because of how we've been raised or how we've been shaped.
Yes. And A Theology of Flourishing, I want to be really clear. It rarely provides answers. It always raises questions. And one of those questions, to use Karl Rahner's work, the Jesuit theologian who's big for me in the book too, is maybe most fundamentally for humans, and I want to be explicit here, for human creatures, the question is the question, who are you? The question that we are to ourselves. And A Theology of Flourishing is always inviting us more deeply into that question, which is going to involve coming up against those hard places, up against those rough edges, and seeing what it really looks like for God to make a way in the wilderness, for God to, make the rough places plain so that we can all walk that path of life individually and collectively. Right. So I think that's a really beautiful way to talk about it.
Yeah. And so, because again, to return to food and the table, where can food and table then enter into this space of creating flourishing or, and we've talked about hospitality, but I'm curious, where would food sit in this construction of flourishing for you?
Yeah, it's so central. And I want to think about it both, without waxing too sort of romantic here, think about it both Eucharistically and sort of, the table. I'll start with the Eucharistic because it's pretty simple. I mean, this project was most profoundly, I think, born of my experience working in ministry in this thriving community that gathered at the Eucharistic table Sunday after Sunday and was transformed in these radical ways that I never had experienced before. I probably never will again. I say that all the time. It was something and it doesn't exist anymore. The place, the spirit, it's all changed.
Right.
Unfortunately, this place does not exist anymore as it was in the time that I was there. And that was just so profound for me, to see that. And so much so that in my own questioning, my own seeking, right, of myself, I was awakened to a desire to, out of my passion for what was happening there, which is a passion for, I think, God working within the community, to say, okay, what is going on here, and why don't we have more churches like this? And what would it mean? How can I do the work of cultivating communities like this one, like St. Mary? And that was what took me to theology. So that's my own personal example of how this discernment happened in community around a table. As far as the other food piece goes, well, I think it's wonderful, and it's also kind of complicated and multifaceted, because as a person that cares deeply about, ecology and food on the sort of justice side, A Theology of Flourishing is going to reorient our relationship to our food. And it's going to ask really critical questions about what we're eating, where it comes from, who produced it, how they were paid, how the land was worked, all of that kind of stuff. And I won't get too into the weeds of that, but it raises deep questions of food systems and sourcing and production, and maybe even the act of gardening, farming ourselves, right, in our backyards. I always say every yard is a garden waiting to be grown. Americans love yards, right? But you can grow stuff in that soil, right? To think about it in those kinds of ways, to be creative, because the love of God is there working through that, through every tomato on the vine, through every, hot pepper we can produce, whatever it is. So our relationship to our food is a big part of the table. And then the other piece is that individual and collective discernment I think happens in a joyful and profound way when people gather around good food to
Yep.
share and share, because that sharing of food is also involves, it also leads to sharing of ourselves. It is sharing of who we are. There's something about sitting around and snacking, or sharing a pizza or kidney or whatever it is, right, that opens us up to others, that grounds community. And so I think that, and this is kind of, again, a Rahnerian, Karl Rahner way of thinking about it, that it's not in the big mystical experiences that we find this work of discernment, that we find this work of God's grace among us. It's in the everyday.
Yeah.
It's in every moment of every day. The Ignatian tradition has this wonderful axiom, finding God in all things.
Yeah.
And they don't mean by that like finding God in the good and the bad in some sort of saccharine way. They mean like really in all things, in every corner of creation, in this conversation, in all the conversations, any of us has with each other, with the world. God is present there. And so how could God not be present, right? In the sharing of a meal, when Jesus, placed the sharing at the meal at the center of his own ministry. And I think just by knowing that and attuning ourselves to it and saying, God is present here, the meal sharing food can become a training ground for sharing ourselves with the world. And that in itself is very Eucharistic, right?
For sure.
That is a paradigm of the Eucharist, right? And I think there's something really beautiful in that, because food nourishes us and it strengthens us to do the work, right? That we are called to do. And that in my mind is the work of flourishing always, our own flourishing and cultivating the flourishing of others. So those are a bunch of different ways that when you ask that question at the table and flourishing, those are the things that, light up for me.
Right. No, and I think, the stories our food and our dishes tell. Like there's a story behind your grandma's Lebanese cooking, and there's stories behind ethnic groups and the food and how they prepare it. And sometimes those stories are born out of pain and sorrow, and sometimes they're born out of joy and celebration. And so I think too, being attuned to how current systems of war or drought wreak havoc on food, and we lose aspects of culture, because when war happens, food is destroyed.
Yes, absolutely. And like you said, food mediates to us, it mediates our cultures to us. It brings, it has history, it carries stories, right, of joy and of struggle. Absolutely. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. That's brought to light because there's this new book. It's called My Last Sweet Bite, by Michael, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Shake. But it's all about where war has torn apart culinary traditions. And, he looks at Czechoslovakian food, and what Soviet, the Soviet reign did to them, and what they lost, and how do you regain food, in a once communist bloc country.
It makes me think too, of course, Gaza, right? Like the situation that we're dealing with right now. We're talking a lot about the intentional starvation of the Palestinian people. But it's not just starvation. I mean, it's principally starvation from food, right? Where there's actually bodily needs, and there's something about that in the gospel, I would say. But beyond that, there is the fact that, and I say this as somebody that has Lebanese heritage, the fact that food and the communal table is the center of the culture, right? There is a starvation for the culture, and the destruction of the culture that is happening through starvation is an added dimension of violence, an added dimension of harm that is happening. I think that's really, really, really illuminating. Yeah.
No, I think we could keep going and, keep talking about flourishing and food. Yeah. But we may lose listeners, after a certain mark,
No.
But like, I think you've given us some frameworks, and some beautiful aspects, if people want to engage in this work, and do this, like what's a step they can take? Like, because this has been a very heady, in some ways, discussion. And so like, how do we help people move our communities, whether it's a church or even just a small group of people, a couple of people, like, how do people begin to move forward?
Yeah. So I would say first and foremost, listen. first and foremost, cultivate practices of deep listening and attunement. Be observant, look up from your phone, look
Yeah.
at the world. Try to attune ourselves to the world as God's creation, and see the ways in which God's life-giving intentions, God's intentions that all things may flourish, are at work around us. And I think that that's an act of, it's a spiritual practice in a way. It's kind of a meditation to say, I'm going to look for the signs of life around me. And then let that attentiveness become a framework for understanding what it means to live as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus in the world. Because when we attune ourselves to that, we can come to see both where that fullness of life is present and where that fullness of life is absent. And that happens again, individually and collectively. We can bring that to our churches, right?
Yeah.
We can use that as a framework for saying, hey, that sermon, that message, that homily was not really good. It actually kind of destroyed the lives of many, or it was wonderfully enlivening. Can we have more, please?
Yeah. Right.
Those kinds of things. So it becomes a paradigm of our ecclesial life as well. It can lead us to take political action, right? If we are attuned in a particular way to the reality in our local community, and we have others who, as church communities or as families or whatever, are impassioned about something that's going on, it can lead us to serve in new ways. So really it's in an invitation into that work of discernment on behalf of that. And I think it starts with listening, it starts with attunement. And if I may say, of course, I think it starts with sharing, right? Ourselves and food, and, being at table in new ways with others, inviting others to the table, is probably one of the most profound ways that we can open ourselves up to discovering the height and breadth and depth and reach of God's love and God's intention that all things may flourish, because it gets us out of our preconceived notions of what that fullness of life means and into the fullness of the fullness, so to speak, by listening to others, by attuning ourselves to others. It brings us into new ways of perceiving the fullness of life for others and for ourselves. And I think out of those practices, we can discover ever more fully those life-giving intentions of God at work around us in every moment.
No, that deep listening and attunement, and
hospitality.
Hospitality,
again.
yeah. I had one when I was starting my master's program. I had one spiritual director say, like, spiritual direction is, one ear towards the directee and one ear towards Jesus. And I sometimes think of what you're saying of like this attunement and discernment of like, okay, how do we listen, to the world, to people, with one ear towards them and one ear towards Jesus, and how might those two aspects of listening inform my being in the world?
It's a beautiful image, and I think that is the heart of discernment, is listening in that way.
Yeah. It's a question I use to wrap up. What's the story you want the church to tell?
I love that question. I want the church to tell the story of God's love as an intention that draws all creation into the fullness of life, and in doing that provides a way for us to understand what it means to be followers of Jesus in our own hikcheitas, in our thisness, and with a view toward the thisness of others on behalf of this vision of the fullness of life cultivated in love of the world.
Beautiful. And then some fun questions about food as we wrap up. What's one food you refuse to eat?
There isn't one.
Oh, wow.
That I can think of.
Okay.
Yeah, there is nothing. There are things that I would prefer not to eat.
Yeah.
But I will still eat them.
Okay.
I've never met a food that I absolutely wouldn't try.
Okay. You're the first. Yeah.
Really?
That's the first. Yeah. Yeah. Everybody has something usually.
I really can't think of anything. Yeah.
No, that's fair. Then on the other end of the spectrum, what's one of the best things you've ever eaten?
Oh gosh. That's a really hard one for me because I love food, and I but I'll say one of the best things I've ever eaten, couple of meals that I would name. One is there's a restaurant in the Museum of Modern Art in New York called The Modern
Okay.
that it's one of the best meals I've ever had in my life. And recently, when I was traveling in Asia, in Japan, in Tokyo, there's a restaurant in Ueno Park called Inshote that was recommended to me by one of my colleagues. And as part of one of the meals, I had this vegetarian multi-course thing that they did. They brought out a bucket of freshly made tofu and a house-made soy sauce and some toppings. And all you do is scoop the tofu, put the toppings, pour the sauce over it, and it was one of the best things I've ever eaten in my entire life.
Wow.
And I didn't know that tofu could be like that. I love tofu, but this was on another level.
I'm sure.
So if you're ever in Tokyo, go to Ueno Park, eat it in Shote. It was incredible.
Wow. No, that does sound incredible. Like, yeah, because I think we associate tofu with the mass-produced store-bought stuff that has no flavor. Like, it's fine, right? Like, we can disguise the flavor. With it.
Yeah. But this was a bucket of freshly made tofu, truly a bucket. Wow. And you'd scoop it out into a bowl, and it was unlike anything I've ever eaten.
Oh, wow. Like a silken tofu, then, I'm assuming? Like,
yeah, very soft soft with the toppings and sauce, and it's magnificent.
Awesome. Yeah. And then finally, there's a conversation among chefs about last meals, as in if you knew you only had one more meal left to enjoy, what would it be? So if Paul had one last meal, what might be on his table?
That's a really hard question. I'm thinking of that tofu now.
I'm sure,
thinking of the meal at Inshote. But the first image that came to mind, Andrew, when you asked that was being able to be at table with friends and loved ones.
Right.
So whatever is on the table, I would want it to be shared. But probably, honestly, now that I've thought about that, the thing that comes to my mind and heart is kibbeh, is the Lebanese baked meat dish that my grandmother used to make and now I make and others, because it's always been sort of the core of, I think, the intersection of community and food for me.
Yeah. No, I love it. Yes. Most often it's a mom's dish, it's a grandma's dish that makes it to people's table.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, Paul, this has been a joy.
Likewise, thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Yeah. If people want to learn more about your work, where can they find you?
So my webpage on the Santa Clara University website where I teach is a great place to go. It has all my publications, videos, podcasts, various things. And my book is available, of course, from the publisher, Orbis Books, or, on any other number of booksellers as well.
Yeah. No, and do get the book. It really does provide a framework. There, he does some great research in the history of the work, and so, yeah, it's a great book to dig into. And I do hope you sort of continue to develop this theology of flourishing and sort of work its way out into more aspects.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope to as well. You've already planted a seed that wasn't planted before with this idea of flourishing as the work of resurrection. So I'm going to hold on to that and think about a Christology. Thank you for planting that seed.
I hope it's a good seed, not another.
I think it will. I think it fell on good ground. So
good.
There you go. All right.
Awesome. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with others. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.